4 men, tied in chains, left to rot on a lonely forest road where the trees grew so thick even the sunlight was afraid to enter. Their wrists were raw, their bodies slumped against the bark like broken statues. One of them wasn't moving at all. Cars passed. Not one stopped. A woman glanced through her windshield, foot never leaving the gas pedal. A trucker slowed just enough to stare, then sped away like he'd seen a ghost. Nobody wanted to know what happened on that road. Nobody wanted to be the next person chained to a tree. But somebody was watching. A boy, 18 years old, carrying nothing but a sack of herbs and a heart heavier than anyone could see, stepped out from the tree line. He didn't run. He didn't call for help, because he had no phone to call with. He just walked forward, slow and steady, toward 4 grown men twice his size, men who, for all he knew, were dangerous, and in a voice that would soon be repeated by 2,000 riders across state lines, he said the only words that mattered.
Don't be scared.
Don't be scared. I'll help you. He had no idea who these men were. He had no idea what one of them carried. And he had no idea that this single decision, made by a boy with nothing to gain, was about to bring an army roaring down that quiet forest road. Before we go further, subscribe now and drop your location in the comments. By the end of this story, you'll see exactly how far it traveled to reach you. Before we get to how Marcus Webb rescued 4 strangers who would change his life forever, we need to go back. Because to understand why an 18-year-old boy would walk toward danger instead of away from it, you have to understand what kind of life had already tested him. Marcus wasn't just smart. He was the kind of smart that made teachers stop mid-lecture and stare. The kind of smart that got him noticed by a scholarship committee 2,000 miles away, offering him a full ride to study engineering in Mexico, tuition covered, housing covered, a plane ticket already being processed with his name on it. For one summer, Marcus Webb believed his life was about to change. He used to sit on the porch steps of his grandmother's small house, sketching bridges and turbines in a notebook with a cracked spine, whispering the names of universities like they were prayers. Eleanor Webb, the only family he had left, would watch him from the kitchen window, flour on her hands, pride swelling in her chest so big it nearly broke her. Because Eleanor knew what Marcus had already survived to get there. His parents had been gone since he was 9. A car accident on a rain-soaked highway took them both in the same terrible night, and just like that, Marcus became an orphan in a house that suddenly felt too quiet. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She took him in without a second thought, raised him on discipline, dinner-table Bible verses, and a love so fierce it filled every gap his parents left behind. She was the reason he survived, and now she was the reason he stayed. Because 2 months before his flight to Mexico, Eleanor collapsed in the kitchen. Diabetes. Advanced, aggressive, unforgiving. The kind that doesn't just require pills. It requires insulin, monitoring, hospital visits, and a level of financial stability neither of them had ever known. The doctors were kind but blunt. Without consistent care, her condition would only get worse. Marcus sat in that hospital waiting room with his scholarship letter still folded in his back pocket, and he made a decision no 18-year-old should ever have to make. He let the scholarship go. He never told his teachers the real reason. He never told his friends. He simply stopped talking about Mexico, stopped sketching bridges, and started looking for work. Because Eleanor Webb had given up everything for him once, and now it was his turn. That's how he ended up working for Mr. Whitfield. Whitfield ran a small feed and supply store on the edge of town, the kind of place with a bell over the door and an owner who remembered everyone's name. He was an older white man, gruff on the surface but fair underneath it, and he was one of the only people in town who looked at Marcus and saw potential instead of pity. "You're wasting a mind like that stacking feed bags," Whitfield told him once, wiping his hands on his apron. Marcus just smiled and kept stacking. "Feed bags pay for insulin, sir." Whitfield didn't say anything else that day, but he started paying Marcus a little extra, under the table, and never asked questions about where it went. Still, it wasn't enough. It was never quite enough. Some weeks Marcus skipped his own meals so Eleanor could have what she needed. Some nights he sat by her bedside doing mental math instead of sleeping, calculating how many more shifts, how many more errands, how many more sacrifices stood between his grandmother and a stable life. And that's what herbs had to do with any of this. Eleanor, raised in the rural South by a mother who trusted the earth more than pharmacies, believed certain wild plants, bitter roots, specific leaves that grew only in shaded, undisturbed forest, helped regulate her sugar levels between doctor visits, stretched the gaps between expensive supplies. Marcus didn't know if it was science or faith. He just knew it was one more thing he could do for her that didn't cost money he didn't have. So twice a week, after his shifts at Whitfield's, Marcus walked the long way home. Through the forest, along the lonely tarred highway that most people avoided after dark. He knew exactly where the herbs grew. He knew exactly how long the walk took. He knew every bend in that quiet road better than he knew his own reflection. What he didn't know, what nobody could have told him, was that on this particular walk home, with the sun beginning to dip behind the tree line and a sack of herbs slung over his shoulder for his sick grandmother, he was about to become part of a story far bigger than himself. Because up ahead, past the bend where the road curved and the trees grew thick enough to swallow sound whole, 4 grown men were chained to trees, beaten, left for dead, and every car that passed them kept driving. Marcus didn't know that yet. He just kept walking, tired, focused, thinking about insulin costs and his grandmother's blood sugar levels, completely unaware that the next few minutes were about to change everything. The road curved the way it always did, past the old fence line where Whitfield's property ended and the county forest began. Marcus barely thought about it anymore. He'd walked this stretch so many times, his feet knew the potholes better than his eyes did. But something was different today. He noticed it before he understood it. A stillness. Not the peaceful kind of quiet the forest usually offered at dusk. The kind of stillness that feels wrong. The kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up before your mind catches up to why. A truck rumbled past him from behind, going faster than it should have on a narrow forest road. Marcus stepped aside instinctively, watching it disappear around the bend ahead. Strange. Nobody drove that fast out here. There was nothing to rush toward, and apparently, something to rush away from. He kept walking. A minute later, a sedan came from the opposite direction. The driver, a woman, maybe in her 40s, had her eyes locked straight ahead, both hands gripping the wheel like she was holding on to something for dear life. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't look at the road ahead of her either, not really. She looked at nothing, the way people look when they're trying very hard not to remember something they just saw. Marcus frowned but didn't stop walking. Then came the third vehicle, an old pickup, the kind Whitfield himself might drive, rattling along slower than the others. This driver did look at Marcus. For just a second, their eyes met, and Marcus saw something he couldn't name yet. Not fear exactly, something closer to guilt. The truck didn't stop either. It just kept going, taillights shrinking into the distance, leaving Marcus alone, on a road that suddenly felt a lot longer than it used to. He adjusted the sack of herbs on his shoulder, and told himself it was nothing. Probably an accident up ahead, cleared already. Probably nothing at all. But the stillness kept building the closer he got to the bend. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost mistook it for wind moving through branches. But wind doesn't groan. Wind doesn't have a rhythm to it. A broken, human rhythm. The sound of someone trying to speak through exhaustion, trying to make noise because noise was the only tool they had left. Marcus stopped walking. Every instinct in his body, the same instincts that had kept him alive through 9-year-old grief, through skipped meals, through years of learning what danger sounded like before he saw it, told him to turn around, to walk the long way home instead. Whatever was making that sound wasn't his problem. He had a grandmother waiting, a bag of herbs that needed to get to her before dark, a life already stretched thin by responsibilities he never asked for. He could be one more car that didn't stop. Nobody would know. Nobody would blame him. 3 vehicles had already passed this exact spot and chosen to keep driving. And not one of them was an 18-year-old boy walking alone on foot, with nothing to defend himself with. But Marcus stood there, herbs on his shoulder, listening to that broken sound carry through the trees. And he thought about his grandmother, about the story she used to tell him when he was small, about the Good Samaritan, about how the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching, but what they do when they think no one will ever know. He took a step forward, then another. The bend in the road revealed itself slowly, the way bad news always does, a little at a time, like the world is trying to give you a chance to look away before it's too late. Marcus pushed through a low-hanging branch, herbs still clutched tight against his chest, and that's when he saw them. 4 men. Enormous men, the kind built from decades of hard living, tied to 4 separate trees with heavy chains wrapped around their wrists. Their clothes were torn. Leather vests, the kind Marcus had only ever seen in passing on the highway, hung ripped and dust-covered on their broad shoulders. Blood had dried dark against sunburned skin. 3 of them were barely conscious, heads hanging, chests rising in shallow, ragged breaths. The 4th, the biggest of them all, with a gray-streaked beard and a patch on his vest Marcus couldn't quite make out from this distance, lifted his head at the sound of footsteps. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The biker searched Marcus's face, waiting, bracing, maybe, for the boy to turn and run like every single person before him had. Marcus didn't run. He set his sack of herbs down slowly in the dirt, took a breath that shook more than he wanted it to, and stepped forward into the clearing. "Don't be scared," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'll help you."
I'll help you.
The biker's cracked lips parted, like he wanted to warn him, tell him to run, tell him he had no idea what he was walking into. But no words came out, only a broken, disbelieving whisper, swallowed by the sound of Marcus's footsteps crossing the last few feet between them. Footsteps that were about to set something in motion neither of them could yet imagine. Up close, the damage was worse than it looked from the tree line. The big one, the one who'd lifted his head, had a gash above his eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face and dried into a dark, cracked line. His wrists were rubbed raw beneath the chains, skin split open from hours of straining against metal that never gave. Marcus could see the patch on his vest now, close enough to make out the shape of it, though not close enough to understand what it meant. A name stitched beneath it, Callahan. "Water," the man rasped. "Bag, saddlebag." Marcus's eyes followed his gaze to 4 motorcycles lying on their sides a few yards off the road, half hidden in the brush, like someone had dragged them there and abandoned them in a hurry. One had a leather saddlebag still strapped to it, flap hanging open. He grabbed it, found a half-empty water bottle inside, and brought it to the man's lips first, then moved fast to the others. One man, younger, maybe mid-30s, with a shaved head and a tattoo crawling up his neck, wasn't responding at all. Marcus pressed 2 fingers to his throat, the way he'd seen in a first aid pamphlet Whitfield kept behind the counter. A pulse. Weak, but there. "He's the one we need to worry about," Callahan said, voice cracking. "Ray." He took the worst of it. Marcus didn't ask what "it" was. Didn't ask who did this, or why, or where they'd gone. There would be time for questions later. Right now, every second mattered, and he'd learned that the hard way, sitting in a hospital waiting room 5 years ago wishing someone had moved faster. He examined the chains. Thick, industrial, wrapped twice around the tree trunks and secured with heavy padlocks. Nothing he could break with his hands. But the way they'd been looped, hurried and sloppy, gave him an idea. Whoever did this hadn't been careful. They'd wanted speed, not permanence. Marcus worked the chain around the second biker's tree, testing the slack, and found what he was looking for, a gap where the metal hadn't been pulled fully taut. He twisted, angled the man's wrist just right, and with effort that made his own arms shake, slid the chain free over the widest part of the hand. One down. Smart kid, Callahan muttered, watching through swollen eyes. Marcus didn't answer. He moved to the next one, Hollis, according to the patch, and repeated the same careful maneuver, sweat now soaking through his shirt despite the cooling evening air. 2 down. His hands were bleeding by the third, the metal biting into his own skin. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not with a man named Ray fading in and out beside him. By the time he reached Callahan's chains, the biggest and most stubbornly wound of them all, the sun had dropped low enough to paint the whole clearing in a deep amber glow, the kind of light that made everything feel like it was happening in slow motion, suspended between one moment and the next. "Why?" Callahan asked quietly, as Marcus worked the final chain loose. "Why'd you stop? Nobody else did." Marcus paused, just for a second, hands still on the cold metal. "Somebody had to," he said simply. It wasn't the answer of a hero. It was the answer of a boy who'd spent his whole life being the one who stayed when everyone else left, who sat by hospital beds, who gave up scholarships, who walked the long way home twice a week for herbs nobody else believed in. Helping wasn't a decision for Marcus. It was just who he was. The chain dropped from Callahan's wrists with a heavy metallic sound, and the big man slumped forward, catching himself against the tree, breathing hard. But Ray still wasn't moving. Marcus knelt beside him, checked his pulse again, weaker now, and felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd freed 3 men, but freedom wasn't the same as survival. Ray needed more than loosened chains. He needed a hospital, fast, and there was no ambulance coming down a road where nobody even bothered to stop. "There's a station," Marcus said, standing fast, mind already racing through the geography of these woods, the way he used to sketch bridges, calculating distance, elevation, time. "Up the hill, maybe 2 miles. Emergency response post. I can make it there faster than anyone could find this spot by accident." "You don't have a phone?" Hollis croaked, barely upright against his tree. Marcus shook his head. "No signal out here anyway. I have to go."
Please don't be dead.
Callahan grabbed his wrist before he could turn, grip weak but urgent. "Kid, what's your name?" Marcus hesitated. There wasn't time for this.
Just a little.
Ray's chest was rising slower with every passing second, and every heartbeat wasted here was a heartbeat Ray might not get back. "Marcus," he said quickly. Marcus Webb, and then he ran. He ran the way he'd never run in his life, not from fear, but toward something. Lungs burning, herbs forgotten in the dirt behind him, the image of Ray's fading pulse, driving his legs faster up a hill that felt endless in the dying light. He didn't know these men. Didn't know what they'd survived, what secrets hung on Callahan's vest, what kind of storm his small act of kindness was about to summon. He only knew that somewhere behind him, a man was running out of time, and somewhere ahead of him, if he was fast enough, there was still a chance to save him. What Marcus couldn't have known, as his footsteps pounded against the cracked forest road, was that the man gasping his name into the dirt behind him, Duke Callahan, wasn't just some stranger who got unlucky on a lonely highway. He was about to become the reason 2,000 riders would soon be searching every town in the county for a boy they only knew by 2 words. "Don't be scared." The emergency station sat at the top of the hill like a small brick miracle. 2 trucks parked outside, lights off. The kind of quiet that told Marcus nobody inside expected trouble tonight. He burst through the door gasping, herbs forgotten, blood drying on his own scraped knuckles, and for one disorienting second, the 2 paramedics on shift just stared at him like he'd fallen out of the sky. 4 men, Marcus managed between breaths. "Forest Road. Mile marker. I don't know the marker, but I can show you. One's not breathing right. Chained up, beaten. Please, please, hurry." That was enough. Training took over. Within 90 seconds, Marcus was in the back of a response truck. directing them down the hill, watching the tree line blur past the window, while a paramedic named Diane radioed ahead for a second unit and, quietly, for police. When they reached the clearing, the scene had changed just enough to matter. Callahan was on his feet now, swaying but upright, using his own belt as a makeshift bandage on Hollis's arm. Ray hadn't moved. The paramedics swarmed him immediately. Oxygen mask, IV line, the practiced urgency of people who'd done this before, but never quite gotten used to how much a few minutes could cost. Marcus stood back at the edge of it all, suddenly aware of how small he felt now that grown adults with equipment and training had taken over. His job was done. Nobody needed him anymore. He turned to leave. "Wait!" Callahan's voice, hoarse but firm, cut through the chaos. "Marcus!" Marcus stopped. The big man limped toward him, one hand pressed to his ribs, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Diane was calling out vitals behind them. Red and blue light hadn't arrived yet, but Marcus could hear sirens somewhere far off, faint and growing. "You don't know who we are," Callahan said. It wasn't a question. "No, sir," Marcus admitted. "Don't need to. You needed help. I was there." Something shifted in Callahan's expression. The look of a man doing math he didn't expect to be doing tonight. Most people wouldn't have stopped. Most people didn't, Marcus said quietly, and there was no bitterness in it, just fact. A paramedic called for Callahan, something about checking his ribs, and the moment cracked open, filled instantly with motion and noise and the arriving thump of a second vehicle's tires on gravel. Marcus took a step back, then another, some old instinct telling him this wasn't his story to stay inside of. He'd done what needed doing. Now there was a bag of herbs still lying in the dirt somewhere behind him, and a grandmother waiting in a dim kitchen, wondering why her grandson was late. "I have to go," Marcus said. "My grandmother, she's sick. I need to get her something before it gets too dark." Callahan looked at him like he wanted to say a dozen things and couldn't find the first one. "At least tell me where to find you." Marcus almost laughed. Not from humor, just exhaustion catching up to him all at once. "Everybody knows the Webb place. Ask anyone." Then he turned, jogged back toward the clearing, found his sack of herbs half crushed but intact where he'd dropped it, and disappeared down the darkening road toward home, leaving 4 bikers, 2 ambulances, and a growing knot of first responders behind him, without so much as a last name. He didn't look back. He didn't think there was any reason to. Eleanor was waiting by the window when he got home, the porch light flickering against the early dark, worry etched into every line of her face the way it always was when he ran late. "Lord Marcus, where have you—" She stopped when she saw his hands, scraped and bruised, dried blood along his knuckles. "What happened to you?" He set the herbs on the kitchen table, suddenly aware of how tired his whole body felt, like the adrenaline had been the only thing holding him upright for the last hour. "Just helped some folks who needed it, Grandma," he said. "I'm fine." Eleanor studied him the way only a grandmother can, seeing straight through the understatement to whatever truth he wasn't telling her yet. But she also knew her grandson. Knew that if Marcus said he was fine, arguing would only waste time neither of them had. "Sit down," she said instead, already reaching for the herbs to prepare them. "Eat something. Tell me while I cook." So he did. The short version anyway. The chains. The men. The run up the hill. He left out how frightened he'd been, how close it had felt, how Ray's stillness had haunted every step of that run. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her hands working through old habit, but her eyes never left her grandson's face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Those men," she finally said. "You didn't know them?" "No, ma'am. And you helped anyway." Marcus shrugged, too tired to make it sound like anything more than it was. Somebody had to. Eleanor set a plate in front of him, but her hand lingered on his shoulder a moment longer than usual. "Baby, you don't know what kind of door you just opened." Marcus didn't understand what she meant. He was 18, exhausted, his mind already drifting toward tomorrow's shift at Whitfield's, toward the insulin bill still sitting unopened on the counter, toward the 100 small burdens that made up his ordinary life. He had no way of knowing that 70 miles away, in a garage lit by a single hanging bulb, Duke Callahan was already on the phone, voice still rough from dehydration, ribs wrapped in gauze, saying 4 words that would ripple through a network Marcus had never even heard of. Find that boy. Now. And somewhere out past the county line, phones were already starting to ring. The garage smelled like motor oil and old coffee, lit by a single bulb swinging slightly from a draft nobody had bothered to fix. Duke Callahan sat on an overturned crate, ribs wrapped tight, one hand pressed to his side, the other holding a phone that had already rung 11 times that night. "I don't care what time it is," he said into it, voice still hoarse. "Wake him up." On the other end, a man named Sully, regional contact, the kind of person who knew how to reach people who didn't answer to normal channels, went quiet for a second before responding. "Duke, you sure about this? You just got out of the hospital." "I checked myself out," Duke said flatly. "I'm sure." He wasn't calling for revenge. That part surprised even him. Whoever had ambushed them on that road, stripped their bikes, chained them to trees and left. That was a matter for the sheriff now, statements already given, an investigation already opened. That wasn't why his hands were shaking as he dialed. He was calling because of the boy. "There's a kid," Duke said, and something in his voice made Sully stop whatever he'd been about to say. 18. Walked out of the woods with nothing. No phone, no weapon, nothing. While 3 cars just drove on past us like we weren't even there. Cut us loose with his bare hands. Ran 2 miles uphill to get us help. Didn't ask for a dime. Didn't even ask who we were. Silence on the line. "Name's Marcus Webb," Duke continued. "Taking care of a sick grandmother. That's all I know. That's all I need to know. What do you want done?" Duke looked down at his wrists, still raw and bandaged, and thought about the moment the boy had knelt in front of him, hands bleeding, working a chain loose like it was the most natural thing in the world to risk yourself for 4 strangers, who might have been dangerous for all he knew. "I want every chapter to hear his name," Duke said. "I want them to know what he did, and I want to be standing in front of that boy again, this time when I'm not chained to a tree." Sully exhaled slowly. "Duke, you know what happens if you put this out wide. This isn't a quiet ask." "I know exactly what happens," Duke said. "Put it out anyway." What Duke Callahan hadn't fully explained to Marcus that night, what Marcus still had no idea of, back home eating dinner beside his grandmother, was who Duke actually was. Not just a club president, not just another biker on a lonely road. Duke Callahan sat at the head of a network that spanned 11 states, a coalition of riding clubs bound not by crime or reputation, but by something older and quieter. A code built over 3 decades, forged through charity runs for sick children, funeral escorts for fallen veterans, and a mutual aid fund that had put roofs back on houses and covered hospital bills for strangers who never even learned who paid them. 12,000 riders, loosely connected, fiercely loyal, all of them answering, in one way or another, to the man whose vest read Callahan, the man who had just been left chained to a tree like garbage, and who a boy with nothing to gain had refused to walk past. That saddlebag on his bike, the one Marcus had reached into for a water bottle without a second thought, it hadn't held cash, or weapons, or anything close to what people might assume of men who looked like Duke and his crew. It held ledgers. Records of the very fund Duke ran, the accounting for the next round of donations the 4 of them had been riding out to deliver to a children's hospital 2 counties over. That's what the ambush had really been about. Word had gotten out, wrongly, dangerously, that Duke Callahan carried something valuable on runs like this. Someone decided robbery was worth the risk. Someone was wrong about what valuable meant. None of that was public yet. None of that mattered right now. What mattered was a single phone call traveling outward like a current, chapter to chapter, state to state. By midnight, 300 riders knew the story. By 3 a.m., that number had tripled. Men and women who'd never met Duke Callahan personally, who only knew him by reputation and the code stitched into their own vests, began doing what riders like them had always done when one of their own called for something that mattered. They started their engines. Marcus woke the next morning to an ordinary day. He didn't know that yet either, that the word ordinary was about to stop applying to his life. He went to Whitfield's like always, stacked feed bags like always, counted the hours until his shift ended so he could check on Eleanor like always. Whitfield noticed the bandages on his hands but didn't ask more than once, respecting whatever silence Marcus needed to keep. It wasn't until Marcus walked out of the store around noon, squinting against the sun, that he heard it. A sound he'd never heard before in this town. Distant at first, then closer, then unmistakable. Engines. Not one or two. Dozens. Then more than dozens. He turned toward the main road just as the first riders came into view over the hill. Chrome catching sunlight. A slow-moving wave of motorcycles that seemed to stretch back farther than he could see. People up and down the street stepped out of shops. Phones already raised. Murmurs rippling through the small town, faster than anyone could explain what was happening. Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk, sack of feed dust still on his hands, utterly unaware that every single rider rolling into town was looking for him. And leading the pack, ribs still wrapped, wrists still healing, was a man Marcus hadn't expected to ever see again. Duke Callahan. The crowd on Main Street had gone still, the way a town does when it senses something is about to happen that it will talk about for years. Marcus stood outside Whitfield's with a sack of feed dust still clinging to his hands, watching motorcycle after motorcycle roll to a stop along the road until there was no more road left to fill. 200, then more, arriving behind them. He'd never seen anything like it, not in this town, not anywhere. Whitfield came out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron, standing beside Marcus like he half expected trouble. "Son, you know anything about this?" "No, sir," Marcus said, and it was the truth. He had no idea. Duke Callahan swung off his bike first, moving slower than he used to, ribs still tender beneath his shirt, but his eyes locked onto the boy standing outside the feed store like he'd been searching for this exact face for days. Behind him, riders were dismounting in waves, but none of them moved forward. They waited. This wasn't their moment. It was Duke's. He crossed the street, boots heavy against the pavement, and stopped a few feet from Marcus. "Told you I'd find you," Duke said, voice rough but steady now, nothing like the broken whisper from the forest. Marcus blinked, recognition washing over him. You're the one from the road. You're okay. Because of you." Duke's jaw tightened, emotion working beneath the surface of a face that didn't look built for showing it. "Ray's okay too. Touch and go for a night, but he's okay. Doctors said another 20 minutes out there, and he wouldn't have made it." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest he hadn't realized he was still holding on to, a worry he'd carried home with him that night and never quite set down. "I'm glad," he said simply. "Real glad." Duke studied him for a long moment, the whole street silent around them, hundreds of riders and half the town watching a conversation that felt too quiet for the size of the crowd surrounding it. "You want to know why there's 2,000 of us standing in your town right now?" Duke asked. Marcus glanced past him at the sea of bikes, chrome and leather stretching farther than he could count, and shook his head slowly. "Honestly, sir, I have no idea." "Because you didn't ask who we were before you helped us," Duke said. "You didn't check my vest for a name you'd recognize. You didn't wait to see if we were good men or bad ones. 3 cars passed us on that road, Marcus, 3. And every single one of them made a choice not to know. You made the opposite choice. That's rare. That's rarer than you understand." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the saddlebag Marcus remembered from that night. The one he'd grabbed a water bottle from without a second thought. never imagining what it held. "You want to know what was in here?" Duke asked, unbuckling the flap. "Not drugs, not cash from anything illegal. Ledgers, kid. Records for a fund 12,000 riders pay into, hospital bills for strangers' kids, roofs for widows, groceries for families who lost everything in a fire. We were riding to deliver the next round to a children's hospital when we got jumped. Somebody heard we carry something valuable and got it wrong about what that word meant." Marcus stared at the worn leather bag, understanding dawning slowly, the pieces of that night rearranging themselves into a shape he hadn't seen before. You're not what people think when they see the vests. Some of us are exactly what people think," Duke admitted. "But most of us are just people who found a family in each other and decided to do some good with it. And now," he paused, glancing back at the riders behind him, an unspoken signal passing through the crowd. "Now we found somebody who did more good in 5 minutes with nothing than most folks do in a lifetime." Marcus didn't know what to say. He looked at Whitfield, who was watching with his arms crossed, and something suspiciously close to pride in his eyes. He looked at the crowd of townspeople gathered along the sidewalk, phones out, murmurs spreading. He looked, finally, back at Duke. "I didn't do it for anything," Marcus said quietly. "I don't need anything for it." "I know," Duke said. "That's exactly why you're getting something anyway." He turned and nodded toward the crowd of riders. A woman near the front, silver-haired, vest covered in patches from what looked like decades of runs, stepped forward carrying a folder. Behind her, 3 more riders wheeled forward something large covered in a canvas tarp. "Your grandmother," Duke said. "Eleanor Webb, diabetic, no consistent insurance, been managing on herbs and prayer for longer than she should have had to." Marcus's stomach dropped. "How do you know about my grandmother?" "Because the second I found out your name, I found out everything about the life you've been carrying alone," Duke said. "The scholarship you gave up, the engineering program in Mexico, the nights you skip meals so she doesn't have to skip her medicine. You think you're the only one who can find things out about people, Marcus?" Marcus felt his throat tighten, a heat behind his eyes he hadn't expected and didn't want in front of a crowd this size. "Sir, I don't need charity." "This isn't charity," Duke said firmly. "This is 12,000 people paying a debt. That's different, and you know it." The silver-haired woman handed him the folder. Inside, paperwork for a fully reinstated scholarship. Not the one he'd lost, but an equivalent program secured through partnerships the Riders Network had spent the last 2 days calling in favors for, along with a fund already established to cover Eleanor's ongoing medical care, permanently, no strings, no expiration. Marcus's hands were shaking as he read it, the words blurring slightly. This is too much." "It's exactly enough," Duke said. "It's what should have happened for a kid like you a long time ago. And didn't, because the world doesn't always notice people who quietly carry more than they should have to. We noticed. That's all this is." Behind them, the tarp came off the large object the riders had wheeled forward. A motorcycle, gleaming, brand new, with a small plaque bolted just beneath the seat. Marcus stepped closer, reading the engraving through eyes he could no longer keep dry. For the boy who wasn't scared. The crowd, silent until now, began to applaud, townspeople and riders together, a sound that rolled down Main Street like thunder, finally breaking after a long, dry season. Whitfield clapped Marcus on the shoulder, unable to hide the pride cracking through his usual gruffness. And somewhere in that crowd of 2,000 strangers who'd become something like family in the space of one honest choice, Marcus Webb realized his life had changed, not because he'd asked for anything, but precisely because he never had. And so the story of Marcus Webb spread far beyond that small town, carried not by news vans or headlines, but by riders who told it at every gas station, every diner, every clubhouse from state to state. The boy who stopped when 3 cars didn't. The boy who never asked who they were before he decided to help. The boy who ran 2 miles uphill for strangers and asked for nothing in return. Eleanor Webb got the care she needed. consistent and dignified, for the rest of her life. She lived to see her grandson graduate, not from the program he'd given up, but from one 12,000 strangers had rebuilt for him, brick by brick, out of gratitude he never demanded. Marcus went on to become an engineer, the kind who designs bridges strong enough to hold weight nobody thinks to question, much like the one he'd built that night between 4 dying strangers and a boy who chose to stop. Duke, Callahan, and Marcus stayed close for the rest of Duke's life. Every year, on the anniversary of that night, the roads leading into that small town would fill again. Not 2,000 riders this time, but a tradition, a reminder, a promise kept. Because here's the truth this story leaves behind. The same truth Eleanor tried to teach Marcus his whole life. The measure of a person isn't what they do when the world is watching. It's what they do when they think no one will ever know. Marcus didn't help 4 chained men because he expected an army to show up in his town one day. He helped because somebody had to, and he refused to be one more person who drove past. In a world that teaches us to look away, to keep driving, to mind our own business and protect our own peace, this story is a reminder that the smallest act of courage, offered to a complete stranger, can travel farther than we will ever know. You may never see 2,000 riders show up outside your door. But somewhere, someone is chained to their own tree, waiting for someone brave enough to simply stop. Be that person. If this story moved you, don't just scroll past it. Subscribe to this channel, because stories like Marcus Webb's deserve to be told, remembered, and passed on. And before you go, drop your location in the comments below, so we can see together just how far this story has traveled. Town to town, state to state, screen to screen. Because kindness, like courage, was never meant to stay in one place.